The school asked the black teacher to remove the inappropriate poster in class until students and parents protested to keep it. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Jordan was told to be less visible, but it was the first time they tried to erase a part of her history and call it inappropriate. Mrs. Camille Jordan had just finished setting up her classroom for the fall semester when the email came. The school board, in its ever-diplomatic tone, requested that she take down the vibrant poster of Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old black girl who, in 1960, had walked through a sea of hate just to attend school. The poster had hung above the whiteboard for years, its colors slightly faded, but its message undiminished. Courage is contagious. But now it was a problem. They say it makes some of the students uncomfortable, said Principal Davis, avoiding eye contact. Which students? Camille asked. There was silence. It wasn't just about the poster. It never was. It was about the way Camille spoke frankly about history, about injustice, about the painful parts of America most teachers skimmed over. It was about the fact that, as the only black teacher in a majority-white school, her very presence was seen as a statement. Camille had taught 8th grade social studies at Meadowbrook Middle School for 9 years. She wasn't naive. She knew how things worked, what got praised, what got flagged, who got warned, and who got fired. But something about this was different. Because it wasn't just her being silenced. It was Ruby. The next morning, Camille stood at the front of her classroom, staring at the poster. Ruby looked back at her, small but fierce, surrounded by 4 towering federal marshals. Camille imagined what it must have felt like to walk into a school where people spat on you, screamed at you, hurled slurs through gritted teeth, and still you walked. And now they wanted her to pretend that never happened. She didn't take the poster down. Instead, she started her first lesson of the year with it. "Class," she said, tapping the edge of the image. "This is Ruby Bridges. In 1960, she was 6 years old when she became the first black child to desegregate an all-white elementary school in New Orleans. She needed protection just to get an education. Today, some people still think this image is too much for you to see." Hands went up. "Why?" asked Tasha, a Latina student with pink braids. "That's what I want us to talk about," Camille said. "Why does truth make some people uncomfortable?" She gave them articles, stories, video clips. Let them discuss it, challenge it, feel it. Her students were curious, passionate, and furious in ways only teenagers can be when they realize the world has lied to them. That week, one of them tweeted a photo of the poster with the caption, "Our teacher isn't taking this down, and neither are we." The photo spread faster than Camille could have imagined. By Thursday, it had been shared over 60,000 times. And that's when the letters started arriving. The first letter was anonymous. Printed in bold, blocky text, it read, "Keep politics out of the classroom or we will go to the district." Camille folded it and tucked it into her desk drawer. The second was from a parent, a mother, handwritten. "Dear Mrs. Jordan, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. My daughter came home talking about Ruby Bridges like she was a superhero. She's never been more proud to be biracial. Please keep teaching them the truth." She cried reading that one. By the end of the week, the principal called her in again. "This is becoming a distraction," he said. "A distraction from what?" she asked. "From history." He sighed. "Camille, you're not in trouble yet. But the board is watching this closely. They're getting calls." "Let them watch," she said. But inside, her heart pounded. Teachers had been fired for less. The protest began on a Tuesday. It started with 3 students, Tasha, Miguel, and Sam. They stood silently outside the school office with signs that read, "We stand with Mrs. Jordan. History is not inappropriate. Let Ruby stay." By lunchtime, 20 more had joined. By Wednesday, parents were showing up. Local news stations arrived with cameras, asking questions the district didn't want to answer. Camille didn't organize any of it. She hadn't even known it was coming. But when she stepped outside and saw the crowd, students of every background, parents holding signs, a second grader holding her mother's hand and chanting, "Let Ruby stay," something inside her broke open. This wasn't about a poster anymore. It was about who got to tell the story, who got to decide what was appropriate. Behind closed doors, the school board held an emergency meeting. Words like policy violation, community standards, and sensitivity were thrown around like shields. But the truth was they were scared, not of Camille, but of the mirror she was holding up to them, of the fact that their silence was being televised. When the decision came, it was wrapped in language meant to sound neutral. After consideration, we acknowledge the educational value of the historical materials in Mrs. Jordan's classroom and will not require their removal at this time. It wasn't an apology, but it was a surrender, and the poster stayed. Camille didn't smile when she read the board statement. She didn't celebrate. She sat in her car, hands still gripping the steering wheel long after the building had emptied out for the evening. Her knuckles were white, her jaw clenched, because this wasn't a win, it was a stay of execution. She knew how they operated. They had backed off because of public pressure, not because they believed in her, not because they respected her judgment as an educator, and certainly not because they believed Ruby Bridges belonged in that classroom. They backed off because their silence had become inconvenient. Still, the image of her students standing outside with cardboard signs, tears in their eyes, fire in their hearts kept her going. This wasn't about Camille Jordan anymore. This was about legacy, about who got to decide what the next generation would remember and what they'd be told to forget. The Monday after the board's decision, her classroom felt different, buzzing. There was a reverence, almost, as the students filed in and looked up at Ruby's image on the wall. It was the same poster, the same faded colors, but now it glowed with a deeper meaning. It had survived. Camille stood in front of them, unsure of what to say, but before she could open her mouth, Miguel raised his hand. "Mrs. Jordan," he said, voice cracking. "Is it true you could have gotten fired?" She paused, then nodded. "Yeah," she said. "It was possible." "Why'd you do it anyway?" Tasha asked. Camille looked at them, all of them, brown faces, white faces, Asian, black, mixed, bright eyes, sharp questions. "Because some things," she said, "are bigger than my job, bigger than this school, even bigger than me." The room was silent, and then a single clap, then another, until every student stood, clapping for their teacher. Not because she had won, but because she had stood. The emails didn't stop. Not all of them were kind. Some accused her of indoctrinating children, of pushing a racial agenda, of teaching hate. Camille didn't respond. She simply kept teaching. But the climate in the teacher's lounge shifted. Some colleagues wouldn't look her in the eye. A few gave passive-aggressive smiles. One even muttered, "Hope you're happy with all the attention," as she passed. She was used to isolation, but now it felt sharper. Still, something was happening. More students started staying after class, asking harder questions, wanting to know more not just about Ruby, but about Fred Hampton, Claudette Colvin, Yuri Kachiyama, Dolores Huerta. They brought books. They brought stories from their grandparents. They brought truth. She gave them the space to speak it. 3 weeks after the protest, Camille received a formal letter from the district. They were launching an investigative review into her teaching materials. Nothing disciplinary yet, but a panel of 5 would evaluate whether she had violated neutrality standards in curriculum. Neutrality, as if history had ever been neutral, as if chains and hoses and segregated lunch counters could be discussed in a vacuum. As if showing a black child being screamed at by grown white mobs could somehow be balanced with, what? Silence? Camille stared at the letter, her stomach twisted. She'd seen this before. The long play. They couldn't fire her for the poster now, but they could start building a case slowly, quietly. Death by bureaucracy. And this time, the public might not notice. 2 days later, a knock came at her classroom door. It was a woman Camille didn't recognize, a mid-40s, brown curls, wearing a school visitor badge. "Mrs. Jordan?" she asked. Camille nodded. "I'm Alina Moore," the woman said. "Tasha's mom." Camille smiled. "Oh yes, She's a joy to teach. Alina stepped inside, glanced around the room, then settled her eyes on the poster. I'm also a civil rights attorney, she said. Camille blinked. I saw the coverage, Alina continued. I saw how the district responded. And if they're trying to build a case against you, I'd like to offer my services pro bono. Camille's mouth fell open. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Alina said gently. Camille did. Together, they formed a strategy. Alina filed a formal request for all communications regarding the district's investigation mails, memos, meeting notes. They uncovered language that hinted at political pressure from certain board members and parent groups, many of whom had a history of opposing diversity initiatives. Then they went further. Alina helped Camille file a formal complaint of retaliatory behavior, citing discriminatory treatment compared to white colleagues who had used similarly controversial materials without facing consequences. Camille didn't want to make this a battle, but they'd already made her a soldier. As fall deepened, the leaves changed and so did the community. More parents came forward. One was a Korean immigrant who said her son had never seen his history represented until Mrs. Jordan's class. Another was a white Vietnam veteran who wrote, I fought in a war for freedom. This woman is fighting for the truth. Don't dishonor either. The district tried to hold its ground, but the ground was shifting beneath them. Petitions circled. Local journalists kept digging. State education advocates began asking hard questions about how neutrality was being used as a weapon of erasure. Then one night, Camille received a text from Alina. Check the board agenda for next week. Camille opened the district's site. Her eyes froze on the screen. Item 4C. Vote to revise policy on historical education materials and classroom autonomy. The board meeting that night was packed. Students, parents, teachers, alumni, even former staff. They wore black. They held signs. They told stories. One student, tears in her eyes, said, Mrs. Jordan taught me that history isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to learn from. Another, a white boy who once struggled in class, stood and said, before her class, I didn't even know what redlining was. Now I can't stop thinking about how unfair it is. When Camille stood to speak, the room hushed. She looked straight at the 5 board members. I am not here to defend my right to teach the truth, she said. I'm here to ask you why you're so afraid of it. Silence. Ruby Bridges is not a threat. She's a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. If that frightens you, then maybe you're not protecting the students. Maybe you're protecting the lie. The crowd erupted. The vote passed. Unanimously, the new policy granted teachers the right to present historically accurate materials without requiring balancing content unless pedagogically appropriate. It also instituted protections against retaliation for culturally responsive teaching. It wasn't just a win for Camille. It was a precedent. A fire had been lit, not just in that district but across the state. Camille returned to her classroom the next day to find something unexpected. A second poster. Someone had hung it quietly on the back wall. A student, perhaps. It was hand-drawn, a little crooked, but bold. It showed Ruby Bridges on one side, and Camille Jordan on the other. Underneath it said, Courage is contagious. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring. And this time she smiled. Winter came, and with it, change. Camille could feel it in the way students walked into her classroom, shoulders straighter, questions sharper. There was a newfound confidence in their eyes, as if they'd learned something no textbook could teach. Not about history, about voice. One morning, after a discussion on the Montgomery bus boycott, Miguel raised his hand. Mrs. Jordan, he said, how do we know when it's our turn to stand up? Camille thought for a moment. You usually don't, she said. You're just already standing, and then you realize the world's watching. He nodded slowly, as if letting it settle. That's what the year had become, a slow, collective realization that their voices mattered. By January, her classroom had transformed. Not in appearance, it still had the same cracked linoleum tiles and fluorescent lights, but in spirit. Her students began taking initiative on their own projects. They started a history podcast called Unwritten Chapters, where they explored stories left out of the curriculum. They interviewed janitors, veterans, grandparents, people whose stories never made it into textbooks. They launched a mural project on the outer wall of the school, the Wall of Truth. Students painted scenes from the civil rights movement, the Japanese internment camps, the Stonewall Uprising, the farm workers' strikes. It became a living history book authored by those learning it. The principal, who had once cowered under board pressure, now boasted about the student-led initiatives on local news. But Camille knew. It had all started with one poster. At the state education conference in March, Camille was invited to speak. She stood before a sea of teachers, many of whom were facing the same suffocating pressure she had endured. Her story had rippled far and wide, sparking similar conversations across districts. Some educators thanked her in whispers. Others cried. After her speech, a young teacher approached her, nervous, hopeful. "I'm the only black teacher at my school," she said. "They told me I was too agenda-driven for showing a documentary on voter suppression. Then I read about you. It reminded me I'm not crazy. I'm not alone." "You're not," Camille said. "Not anymore." But not everyone welcomed the change. Camille's face became a symbol admired by many, resented by others. She was doxxed online, received thinly veiled threats. One morning she arrived to find the mural outside had been defaced, black paint splashed across Rosa Parks' face. The words "lies don't belong here" scrawled underneath. Students were devastated. Some cried. Some wanted to skip class. Camille gathered them in a circle. "They wanted to make us afraid," she said softly. "But fear is how they win. So, what do we do?" Tasha stood up. "We repaint." Sam added, "We make it bigger." And they did. The next weekend, more than 50 students showed up with paint cans, brushes, gloves. Parents brought food. Alumni came back to help. Even local artists donated time and materials. By sundown Sunday, the mural had doubled in size. And under Rosa Parks' face, they added new words. "The truth can't be painted over." The district was watching again. But this time, Camille didn't care. She had become more than a teacher. She was a spark, a symbol. And in that role, she felt a deep sense of duty not just to her students, but to every young person who'd ever been taught to lower their voice, to shrink their history. She began consulting with other districts, helping them design inclusive curricula, training other teachers on how to handle pushback with grace and grit. One school in Texas invited her to speak at their graduation. Another in Georgia built an entire month-long unit around her story, calling it the poster that stayed. Camille's name traveled further than she ever expected. But back home, she stayed grounded. She still rose at 6 a.m., still packed her lunch, still taught 8th grade social studies. Because the work wasn't glamorous. It was daily. In late spring, a letter arrived. Not from the district. Not from the board. From Ruby Bridges. Camille opened it slowly, hands trembling. "Dear Mrs. Jordan, I saw what you did, what you stood for, and more importantly what you refused to stand down from. When I was a child, I didn't understand the full weight of what was happening. I just knew I had to walk forward, even when the world screamed at me not to. But now I see it echoed in you, in your students, in every child who learns that history isn't something we memorize, it's something we shape. Thank you for keeping the truth alive. With pride, Ruby Bridges Hall." Camille wept, not out of pride or recognition, but out of gratitude for the cycle, for the chain of courage passed down through generations. She framed the letter, hung it on the wall beside the original poster. Now Ruby watched over her, and Camille watched over the next. The school year ended with a graduation unlike any before. Parents packed the gym. Student speeches were raw, personal. Tasha spoke about how her identity used to feel like something to hide. "Mrs. Jordan didn't just teach me about history," she said. "She taught me that I belonged to it." Miguel shared how he planned to study law. Not to make money, but to protect stories. Even quiet Sam, always hesitant to speak, stood with trembling hands and said, "This year, I found my voice. And once you find it, you can't unhear it." Camille sat in the back row, hands clasped, tears in her eyes. No test score, no rubric, no district evaluation could ever capture this. That summer, the district quietly revised their teacher guidelines again. They added new language affirming the right to teach historically marginalized perspectives. They created a committee to ensure classroom materials represented the full spectrum of American experience. They offered Camille a new position, Director of Equity and Historical Literacy. She declined, not out of defiance but clarity. "I belong in the classroom," she said. "That's where the revolution starts." Years passed. The mural faded again, repainted once more. New students came, some unaware of the battle that had been fought in the very halls they now rushed through on their way to math or lunch. But every year, Camille started with the same lesson. She'd stand beneath the poster of Ruby Bridges and ask, "Why does truth make people uncomfortable?" And they would talk, and they would grow, and another fire would spark. Epilogue. 5 years later, an entire chapter in a new national civics textbook was titled, "The Classroom That Refused to Forget." It opened with a photograph, poster, a black child, for marshals, and a single quote in bold beneath, "Courage is contagious." And beneath that, in smaller print, dedicated to Camille Jordan and the students of Meadowbrook Middle School who taught the nation what education really means. And white heavy check mark.